I was the biggest, and I was not afraid of anything happening. So, like, that was a time where I felt bulletproof almost. They wouldn't let me. There was a lot of stuff, Mark. You're not allowed to do that. Like, chill, because people were afraid, and people aren't afraid in wrestling no more.
Mark Henry's greatest WWE run did not end with the moment he became World Heavyweight Champion. It ended several months later, when the man who had spent 2011 making everyone else suffer finally discovered what it felt like to lose everything. At TLC 2011, Henry entered a chairs match against Big Show with the World Heavyweight Championship at stake. The symbolism was almost impossible to ignore. Steel chairs had become one of the most recognizable weapons in Henry's transformation, and now those same weapons were surrounding the final chapter of his reign. Big Show eventually caught Henry with the WMD and pinned him, taking the championship away. But Henry still had enough anger left to make one final statement. Instead of accepting the defeat, he attacked Big Show after the match and left the new champion vulnerable. That was when Bryan appeared with the Money in the Bank briefcase. Bryan saw an opportunity that might never come again, rushed into the ring and successfully cashed in on Big Show. Suddenly, everything Henry had built had collapsed. He had lost his championship, Big Show had taken it from him, and Bryan had immediately taken it from Big Show. The Hall of Pain had reached its ending, but the real story was only beginning to make sense, because to understand why Mark Henry's fall mattered, you have to move backward. You have to go back before the championship, before the attacks, before the steel chairs became part of his identity. You have to go back to the point when Henry stopped looking like the unstoppable monster and started looking like a champion who was desperately trying to keep control. Once the title was around his waist, the dynamic changed. Big Show was no longer simply another opponent. He was the one man Henry knew could take everything away from him, and that fear slowly began exposing cracks in the monster, who had seemed invincible only months earlier. Big Show had already been through the Hall of Pain once. At Money in the Bank, Henry defeated him and then decided that a normal victory wasn't enough. He placed a steel chair around Big Show's leg and attacked it with a splash, leaving the giant badly injured. This was more than an ordinary post-match assault. It established the brutal pattern that would define Henry's reign of terror. He wasn't satisfied with beating people. He wanted to leave a message behind. He wanted everyone watching to understand that getting into the ring with Mark Henry could have consequences long after the match ended. That was why Big Show's return was such a serious threat. Henry had built his reputation by destroying giants, but Big Show was different. He had already survived Henry once, and now he wanted revenge. When the two eventually collided at Vengeance, the match turned into something neither man could control. Henry managed to lift Big Show and send him crashing down with a superplex, but the impact was so violent that the ring collapsed beneath them. There wasn't even a winner. The image itself became the story. Two enormous wrestlers had pushed each other so far that the structure holding them couldn't survive the collision. Yet that spectacular moment also marked the beginning of Henry's decline. The monster was still powerful, but he wasn't as comfortable as he had been earlier in the year. At Survivor Series, Henry chose to get himself disqualified rather than risk losing his championship. Then Big Show attacked his leg with a chair. Suddenly, the man who had spent months using chairs to destroy other wrestlers was lying there injured by the same kind of weapon. The Hall of Pain had begun turning against its creator. Henry still had the championship, but the aura surrounding him was changing, and that injury created an opening for Bryan. Bryan was carrying the Money in the Bank briefcase, meaning Henry could never feel completely safe. Bryan had already attempted to cash in after Henry was knocked out, although that attempt was reversed because Henry had not been medically cleared to compete. Even though Henry kept the title, the moment exposed something important. The champion who once looked impossible to touch was suddenly vulnerable. Everyone around him could see it. Big Show could see it. Bryan could see it, and eventually Henry could see it too. Still, Mark Henry refused to fall immediately. Even with his injured ankle, he defended the championship against Bryan inside a steel cage. Bryan had the speed and determination to make the champion work, but Henry survived. He hit Bryan with the world's strongest slam from the second rope and retained his championship. It was another victory, but it didn't feel like the victories that had created the Hall of Pain. Henry was no longer simply destroying everyone in front of him. Now he was surviving challenges, protecting his title, and trying to hold together a reign that was slowly becoming surrounded by danger. To understand how different that was, go back to the moment Henry became champion. At Night of Champions 2011, he stood across the ring from Randy Orton, one of WWE's most established and protected stars. Orton had spent years becoming one of the company's most dangerous competitors. He had the RKO, the experience, the speed, and the reputation. But Mark Henry had something else. He had finally reached the point where intimidation no longer worked on him. He had spent months building momentum, and now he had the opportunity to prove that all those years of waiting had led somewhere. The match became a clash between Orton's athletic ability and Henry's overwhelming strength. Every time Orton looked for an opening, Henry found a way to shut it down. Eventually, when Orton tried to change the momentum, Henry countered and connected with the world's strongest slam. The referee counted 3, and after 15 years with WWE, Mark Henry was finally World Heavyweight Champion. The man who had spent so much of his career watching other wrestlers reach the top had finally reached the summit himself. But Henry's celebration revealed what this championship really meant. This wasn't simply another title victory. It represented vindication. For years, people had questioned whether Mark Henry would ever become the kind of main-event wrestler WWE had originally envisioned. Now he had the championship around his waist. Every joke, every setback, every missed opportunity had been answered by one image: Mark Henry standing as World Heavyweight Champion. After 15 years, the doubters had finally been forced to look at him differently. Randy Orton wasn't finished, though. He received another opportunity, this time inside Hell in a Cell. Henry survived that challenge as well and remained champion. But after the match, he attempted to repeat one of the rituals that had become associated with his reign. He tried to place Orton's leg inside a steel chair. Orton managed to escape before Henry could complete the attack. That small moment mattered because someone had finally gotten away from the punishment that had become Henry's signature. The Hall of Pain was still standing, but its victims were beginning to fight back. And Randy Orton wasn't even the first major name to experience Henry's new brutality. Before the championship, before the final rivalry with Big Show, there was Sheamus. Sheamus was one of the few men on SmackDown who refused to act intimidated by Henry. At SummerSlam, the two collided, and Henry managed to defeat Sheamus by countout after driving him through the barricade. Sheamus later returned the favor by beating Henry by countout, but Henry wasn't interested in accepting the result. He attacked Sheamus afterward, making it clear that winning the match wasn't the only thing that mattered anymore. Henry wanted control. Before Sheamus came another giant. Kane had just finished a brutal confrontation with Randy Orton when Henry appeared. Kane was already exhausted, but Henry didn't care. He attacked him, trapped Kane's leg inside a steel chair, and delivered the same kind of splash that had become Henry's calling card. The message was becoming obvious. Henry wasn't choosing easy opponents. He was deliberately targeting powerful men because destroying giants made his transformation feel real. The larger the victim, the more frightening Mark Henry became. Vladimir Kozlov became another victim as Henry continued his assault on SmackDown. The pattern was now established. Henry would find someone who stood in his way, overpower them, and leave them damaged enough that everyone else would think twice before stepping forward. Nobody wanted to become the next name added to the list. That fear was exactly what Henry wanted. For years, WWE had presented him as a physically imposing wrestler. Now, for the first time, he was being presented as the man that physically imposing wrestlers were afraid to face. But none of this would have happened without Big Show. The Hall of Pain was born from humiliation. In June 2011, Big Show was dealing with Alberto Del Rio when Mark Henry became involved. Big Show attacked Henry and completely overwhelmed him. The world's strongest man was beaten badly enough that he had to be taken away on a stretcher. For a wrestler who had spent years being criticized for failing to live up to his potential, this could have become another embarrassing chapter. Instead, Henry returned with something different inside him. He wasn't coming back to prove that he was still strong. He was coming back angry. Henry eventually attacked Big Show and sent him through the announce table. Then he kept going. The violence didn't stop with one attack. He continued targeting Big Show, interfered in other situations, and began behaving like someone who had completely abandoned the version of Mark Henry WWE fans were used to seeing. Eventually, Henry teamed with Christian against Randy Orton and Kane, and pinned Orton with the world's strongest slam. That was the moment the championship picture could no longer ignore him. Randy Orton was the World Heavyweight Champion, and Mark Henry had just pinned him. But the deeper story had started much earlier than that. Mark Henry had been in WWE for years without becoming the superstar many expected. Even winning the ECW championship in 2008 had not completely changed his position. By 2011, he was already 39 years old. 15 years had passed since WWE first signed him, and the window for a major transformation was becoming smaller. He had watched other wrestlers receive opportunities while his own career repeatedly stalled. He had been treated as a big man, a strong man, a dangerous man, but rarely as the man at the center of the company. Then came the 2011 draft, and Henry moved to SmackDown. The timing could hardly have been better. The brand needed new energy. Randy Orton was becoming one of its central stars, and Christian was involved in the World Heavyweight Championship picture. Henry arrived with a completely different attitude. The old version of him was disappearing. He turned on partners and began showing that he was no longer interested in playing the role WWE had repeatedly given him. But even then, the company didn't immediately treat him like a future champion. He was still losing. He was still being overlooked. There was even a moment when the fans were given the chance to decide who would receive the next championship opportunity, and they chose Randy Orton. Once again, Mark Henry was passed over. For Henry, that was simply another reminder of the pattern that had followed him for years. Younger wrestlers moved ahead. Established stars received the spotlight. Henry remained the big man waiting for his turn, but something was changing. He was approaching the end of the road where waiting made sense, so he stopped waiting. That was the real beginning of the Hall of Pain. Mark Henry didn't suddenly become physically stronger in 2011. He had always been one of the strongest men in WWE. What changed was the way he used that strength. He stopped trying to convince people that he deserved respect and started forcing them to give it to him. Big Show gave him the humiliation that sparked the transformation. Henry turned that humiliation into anger. The anger became violence. The violence became victories. The victories created fear. And that fear eventually led him directly to the World Heavyweight Championship. That is why telling the story backward changes the way the entire Hall of Pain looks. When you begin at TLC, it appears to be a story about a champion who lost his title. Move backward, and it becomes a story about a champion whose confidence was slowly being attacked. Go further back, and it becomes a story about a monster who learned how to dominate giants. Go further still, and you discover that the monster was created by one of the men he eventually destroyed. And finally, when you reach the beginning, you discover that the Hall of Pain was never really about chairs, championships, or even revenge. It was about 15 years of frustration finally becoming something powerful. Mark Henry had spent most of his WWE career waiting for the company to see what he believed he could become. In 2011, he stopped asking. He became ruthless, targeted the biggest names on SmackDown, defeated Randy Orton for the World Heavyweight Championship, and created one of the most memorable versions of his character. For a brief period, nobody wanted to be the next person standing across the ring from him, and maybe that's why the Hall of Pain remains so memorable, because Mark Henry didn't need to become somebody completely different. He needed to destroy the version of himself that had spent 15 years waiting for somebody else to believe in him. The championship eventually disappeared. Big Show eventually got revenge. Bryan eventually walked away with the title, and the Hall of Pain eventually came to an end. But for those few months in 2011, Mark Henry finally became the wrestler everyone had been waiting to see. Not just the world's strongest man, a champion, a monster, and a man who had finally decided that if WWE wasn't going to give him his moment, he was going to take it himself.